The Pine Barrens have always been a mouth. For 3 centuries, this forest has swallowed the inconvenient. The duels, the debts, the desperate men who believed wilderness was the same as silence. The soil here is not ordinary earth. It is a ledger. Every root a record. Every buried stone a confession pressed flat by time and indifference. The pines do not grieve. They simply wait. And tonight, the earth is opening again. 4 men whose names the universe has already begun erasing move through the amber half-light with the mechanical efficiency of cowards. They wear masks because they know their faces are ugly with guilt. They drag Dwayne Santino, a man who once made entire city blocks hold their breath, through the mud as though he is luggage abandoned at the wrong terminal. He wore a $5,000 suit this morning. He owns nothing now but the dwindling column of air above a hole that smells of rot and broken promises. 12 feet away, pressed into the cold ground like a coin dropped and forgotten, is Dalia. The masked men see debris, leaves, irrelevance. The universe sees the granddaughter of survivors who outlasted empires. It is watching her fingers tighten around a rusted blade. And it already knows what the history books will say about this precise, unremarkable, so devastating moment before the knife leaves her hand. The hole was 4 feet deep when Dalia stopped breathing. She had been still for 11 minutes. She counted by the pulse hammering in her throat. Pressed flat against the forest floor, with her chin in the mud and the smell of pine resin thick in her nose. The 4 masked men worked in near silence, communicating in the clipped, efficient gestures of people who had done organized, terrible things before. 1 held a shovel. 2 held Dwayne's legs. The 4th stood apart with his arms crossed, watching the tree line like a man waiting for a delayed flight, bored and certain nothing would interrupt him. Dwayne Santino wasn't screaming anymore. That was what scared her most. When they'd first dragged him through the clearing, he had been fighting, pulling against the rope at his wrists, twisting his shoulders, making them work for every inch of ground. But the toxin they'd fed him at the cafe was patient, the way cruelty is always patient. And somewhere between the first shovel strike and the 3rd, his body had gone heavy and deliberate, like a man conserving the last reserves of something precious. His eyes were half open. His chest moved in shallow, careful increments. He was still in there. Dalia could tell by the way his fingers kept pressing into the dirt, not clawing, just pressing, as though he was trying to read the earth through his palms. The pit reached his collarbone. She looked at the folding knife in her hand. It had a 4-inch blade she'd sharpened on subway grating, a cracked handle wrapped in electrical tape she'd peeled off a dumpster behind a diner on Route 9 in Lakewood, New Jersey, 3 weeks ago. She used it to cut shrink wrap from crates, to open cans, to slice the occasional piece of fruit she managed to trade for on good days. It was not a weapon. It was a tool that had kept a 13-year-old girl functional in a country that had no record of her existence. She threw it anyway. The knife cleared 6 feet of air and landed flat against Dwayne's palm with a sound no louder than a dropped coin. His fingers closed around it before the echo died. One of the masked men, the tall one, the one with the crossed arms, snapped his head toward the brush. Dalia had already gone boneless against the ground, melting into the leaves, becoming exactly the kind of nothing she had spent 3 years perfecting. Something moved, the tall one said. "Deer," said the one with the shovel. That wasn't a deer. Dwayne moved, even drugged and half-buried and rope-burned at the wrists. The man moved with a speed that seemed to belong to a different species. The blade opened. The rope parted. He came up out of that hole not like a man escaping, but like something the earth had finally decided to eject. And the sound that left his throat was low and formless, and made the tall masked man take one involuntary step backward. They ran, all 4 of them, into the pines and the gathering dark, leaving their shovels and their certainty behind them in the New Jersey dirt. He found her still on the ground. She hadn't moved, hadn't been sure she could. And when the big man in the ruined suit crouched down to her level, his breathing was ragged and his face was streaked with mud and something that might have been blood from a cut above his ear. Up close, he was less frightening than she'd expected, and more frightening in ways she hadn't anticipated. The gold watch still on his wrist, the way his eyes focused on her with an attention so complete, it felt like being weighed. "You threw that knife," he said. It wasn't a question. Dalia sat up slowly and said nothing. A wind moved through the canopy above them, pulling a scatter of leaves loose into the dark. "How old are you?" 13. He studied her face for a long moment. The freckles, the hollow cheeks, the clothes that had been washed in gas station sinks until the color had given up entirely. She watched him cataloging details the way she cataloged exits. "Where are your people?" "I don't have people," she said. "I have a bag." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have left immediately if it had been pity. It was closer to recognition. The look of a man who understood what it cost to carry everything you owned and call that freedom. He stood, straightened what remained of his jacket, and held out his hand. "My name is Dwayne Santino. You saved my life in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey tonight, which means I owe you something I don't know how to calculate yet." His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Come with me." Dalia looked at the hand, looked at the dark tree line where 4 men had disappeared. She took it. Neither of them spoke on the walk back to the road, but when the headlights of his waiting car cut through the trees and she saw the driver's face tighten with alarm at the state of his employer, Dwayne said only one quiet sentence into his phone before he helped her into the back seat, and the word she caught, the only word that mattered, was permanent. She didn't know what he meant yet, but for the first time in 3 years, she didn't reach for the bag she always kept packed by the door. She had left it in the woods, and somehow she didn't want to go back. The estate sat behind 3 acres of black iron fence on the edge of Colts Neck, Pennsylvania, the kind of property that doesn't appear on real estate listings because it has never needed to. The car turned through the gate at midnight, gravel announcing their arrival in the particular way that gravel does at wealthy addresses. Measured, unhurried, certain of itself. Dalia pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched the main house emerge from the darkness the way a ship emerges from fog. Gradually, then all at once, too large to be believed. She had slept for 40 minutes in the back seat. She hadn't meant to. Sleep was something she rationed carefully, the way she rationed everything, taken in fragments, in subway cars and library corners, and the narrow back rooms of places that asked no questions in exchange for small, exhausting labors. But the seat was warm, and the car smelled of leather and something faintly cedar, and her body, which had been operating on borrowed time since the Pine Barrens, had simply made the decision without consulting her. Dwayne hadn't woken her. She registered that fact the way she registered all kindnesses, carefully, with the quiet suspicion of someone who had learned that warmth was usually a prelude to something being asked. Inside, the house was controlled and precise. Pale stone floors, high ceilings with recessed lighting set low for the hour. A man named Garrett, silver-haired and unflappable, in the way of people who have seen their employer arrive home in worse conditions, met them at the door with a medical bag and an expression that asked no questions. He cleaned the cut above Dwayne's ear in the kitchen, while Dalia sat across the island on a stool that cost more than any bed she'd slept in, holding a glass of water with both hands, and watching the 2 men move around each other with the efficiency of long practice. "The guest room on the east wing," Dwayne said. "Already prepared," Garrett replied, pressing a square of gauze against the cut. I took the liberty when you called." Dalia looked down at her clothes. The mud from the forest floor had dried into the fabric and cracked along the creases of her elbows. Her shoes had left a faint trail of Pennsylvania dirt across the pale stone. The awareness of it sat on her chest like something with weight. "I can stay somewhere smaller," she said. "I don't need the whole room." Both men looked at her. Dwayne's expression did not shift. "You saved my life tonight. You'll have the room." He said it the way people state geography. Flat. Certain. Non-negotiable. Garrett led her upstairs, showed her the bathroom with its thick white towels and its water pressure that felt almost aggressive after years of shelters and rest stops, and left a folded set of clothes, a shirt, soft trousers, wool socks, on the edge of the bed without comment. When she emerged from the shower 20 minutes later, clean for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, she stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the girl looking back. Same freckles, same wild curls, darker when wet. But something in the eyes was different, something careful and calculating that hadn't been there before the Pine Barrens. She found Dwayne in the study on the ground floor. He had changed into clean clothes and was standing at the window with a glass of water. Not liquor, she noticed, looking out at the dark grounds. He turned when she entered. "Sit down, Dalia." She sat in the chair across from his desk. He remained standing, which she understood was not a power move, but simply the behavior of a man whose body was still processing the events of the evening, still insisting on being upright as proof of something. "I need to know your situation," he said. "So not to use it, to understand what I'm working with." She told him. Not everything. She was 13, not naive, but enough. The country she'd left when she was 10, whose name she still said quietly, like a word that might break. The aunt in Trenton who had died of pneumonia 18 months ago and left Dalia with nothing but a folding knife and the knowledge of how to make herself invisible in a country that had no paperwork confirming she existed. When she finished, the study was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a car moved along the distant road toward the Garden State Parkway, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling like a slow clock hand. "No documents," Dwayne said. It wasn't a question. "No documents." He nodded once, set down his glass, and looked at her with that same precise, complete attention he'd turned on her in the woods. "Then we build them. Legally. Correctly. Whatever it takes, and however long it takes." He paused. "Oh, you saved my life in those woods tonight, with a 4-inch blade and 11 minutes of discipline that most grown men I know couldn't manage. That is not a debt I can pay with a guest room and a hot shower." Dalia studied her hands. The knuckles were still faintly red from the cold ground. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "I could be anyone." "You could be," he agreed. "But you're not. You're the girl who had every reason to run and didn't." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "Get some sleep, real sleep, in a real bed. Tomorrow we start making you visible to the right people." She listened to his footsteps cross the stone floor and climb the stairs. The house settled around her, the tick of a hallway clock, the faint hum of climate control, the absolute luxury of walls that belonged to someone who could defend them. She was still sitting there, in the chair, thinking about the word visible, when she heard the soft alert of Dwayne's phone from somewhere above her, and the distinct change in his footsteps that followed. Not the measured tread of a man heading to bed, the urgent, purposeful stride of a man who had just received very bad news. Dr. Renata Osei arrived at the Colts Neck estate at 6:45 in the morning, while the frost was still making its case on the lawn, and the sun hadn't yet committed to the horizon. She carried a black case the size of a briefcase and the particular expression of a physician who had long ago made peace with unusual hours and unusual clients. Dwayne met her in the study. He had not slept. Dalia heard the doorbell from the east wing and sat up in the dark, her hand reaching instinctively for a knife that was somewhere in a Pennsylvania forest. The gesture reminded her where she was. She pulled the wool blanket tighter and listened to the low movement of voices below, not parsing tone the way she had learned to parse everything. Not the words, but the shape of them. Measured. Serious. No alarm yet. She stayed in the room, which felt like its own form of trust. Downstairs, Dr. Osei worked with the unhurried precision of someone who did not permit urgency to become sloppiness. She drew blood, noted the cut above Dwayne's ear, checked his pupils and his resting heart rate, and asked him to describe the sequence of the previous evening in clinical, to chronological terms. He did. She listened without interruption, which was one of the things he had always valued about her. The woman treated information the way a surgeon treats a field. Nothing wasted. Nothing ignored. "The heaviness in your limbs," she said, holding one of the small collection vials up to the lamp. "The clarity that broke through in intervals. The way your cognition lagged behind your instinct." She set the vial down. "That's not alcohol. That's not a standard sedative." "I know what it is," Dwayne said. "I need you to confirm it." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "I'll run the full panel at the lab in Princeton. But based on your description and your vitals, you're presenting consistent with scopolamine derivatives, possibly compounded with something to delay onset." She paused. "Whoever dosed, you knew what they were ordering, and they knew your habits well enough to time it." The room held that information quietly. "How long was the window?" he asked. "Between ingestion and full effect? 40 minutes? Perhaps 50. She closed her case with a soft click. "You were somewhere specific." "The cafe on Meridian," he said. "I go every Thursday." Every Thursday. The same corner table, the same double espresso, the same ritual he had maintained for 11 years, because the cafe had been his mother's idea, or opened with her savings in Newark's ironbound district, before the neighborhood had become the kind of place food magazines wrote about. He had kept the original copper counter. He had kept her recipe cards in a drawer behind the bar. He had kept going back every Thursday, the way you keep returning to anything that still holds the shape of someone you've lost. He pulled out his phone and opened the security feed he'd accessed during the night. The one small mercy of insomnia felt to the cafe's interior camera. Thursday morning, time stamped. He turned the screen toward Dr. Osei, not because she needed to see it, but because saying it aloud required a different kind of preparation. The footage showed the bar. It showed his espresso being prepared. And it showed the hands that prepared it, unhurried, familiar, wearing his father's old signet ring on the right index finger. Fernando, his younger brother, had been behind the copper counter. Dr. Osei studied the screen for a moment, and then looked at Dwayne with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood that some information was not hers to react to. "I'll have the full confirmation to you by noon," she said. "Whatever you decide to do with it, do it after you've slept at least 4 hours. Your judgment is compromised when your body is still clearing a compound." He walked her to the door, returned to the study, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the frost release its grip on the lawn as the morning brightened over Monmouth County. If this story is being enjoyed by you, like the video and subscribe so we can keep bringing light into dark places. Every click helps these stories travel a little farther. Fernando had managed the cafe's accounts for 2 years, a gesture Dwayne had made toward inclusion, toward the fiction of family. He had given his brother access to the one place in his life that wasn't about leverage or territory, the one place that still smelled like his mother's cardamom and old wood, and the particular warmth of something built by honest hands. And Fernando had walked behind that counter and used it as an operating table. The sound of a floorboard overhead told him Dalia was awake and moving carefully through the unfamiliar room. the small, more deliberate sound of a person who had spent years making herself light enough not to disturb anyone's peace. He was still at the window when Garrett appeared in the doorway, holding a manila envelope that had been left at the gate. No courier, no postmark, no return address. Just Dwayne's name on the front, written in his brother's handwriting. The envelope contained a single photograph and a business card. The photograph was of Dalia, taken from a distance, and slightly blurred at the edges the way surveillance images always are, as though the act of watching someone without their knowledge produces its own distortion. She was sitting on a milk crate behind a grocery warehouse off Route 1 in South Brunswick, eating something from a paper bag, unaware of the lens. The timestamp in the corner read 6 weeks ago. The business card belonged to a man named Deputy Director Harlan Fitch, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Newark Field Office. And Dwayne read both items twice. Then he placed them face down on the desk, went to the kitchen, and drank a full glass of water standing at the sink. It was the kind of deliberate, small action a man performs when the alternative is doing something he cannot take back. Fernando arrived at 11. He came through the front gate in a charcoal Mercedes, dressed in a suit that was almost as good as the one Dwayne had ruined in the Pine Barrens. Almost, but not quite, which had always been the geometry of their relationship. Garrett showed him to the sitting room without being asked, because Garrett understood that the controlled environment was the point. You do not meet a threat in a hallway. You put it in a chair and keep the exits behind you. Dwayne was already seated when Fernando walked in. His younger brother was 40 years old, lean in the way of men who turned anxiety into discipline, or with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, a fact that had always struck Dwayne as a particular cruelty of genetics. Fernando smiled. It was the smile of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was pleased with his preparation. "You look well," Fernando said, considering. "Sit down." Fernando sat, crossed one leg over the other, and looked around the room with the proprietary ease of someone measuring square footage. "Nice place. And you've added the Basquiat since I was last here." "The envelope," Dwayne said. The performance of casualness dropped only slightly, like a stage curtain shifting in a draft. Fernando reached into his jacket and produced a second photograph. This one clearer, taken closer, Dalia's face in full detail, and set it on the coffee table between them. "She's 13, Fernando said. "No documentation, no legal guardian, no record of entry." He tilted his head. "The Fitch contact is real. By the way, we've had a working relationship for about 18 months. He moves quickly when motivated, and he's very motivated by the kind of motivation that has rooting numbers." The room was quiet enough that Dwayne could hear the heating system cycling through the walls. "What do you want?" he said. Not a question. A formality. The Meridian properties, the logistics contracts through the Camden terminal, the holding company in Delaware. Fernando produced a folded document from his inside pocket and placed it beside the photograph. "It's all there, clearly itemized. Your attorney will find the language clean. We used someone good." Dwayne looked at the document without touching it. His mother had opened the cafe in the Ironbound district with $14,000 saved over 9 years of work. The Camden contracts had taken him 3 years to negotiate. The Delaware holding company was the legal architecture that protected 47 employees and their families from the volatility of the market. What Fernando was describing was not a hostile takeover. It was a demolition. "You drugged me," Dwayne said. "You put me in the ground with 4 men in masks." "I needed you frightened," Fernando said simply. "Not dead. Dead creates problems. Frightened creates signatures." He gestured at the document. "And here we are." "Here we are," Dwayne agreed. "You have 24 hours. After that, Harlan Fitch gets a file, and the girl gets a one-way process to a country she barely remembers." Fernando stood, buttoning his jacket with the measured movements of a man who believed the negotiation was already over. "This doesn't have to be painful, Dwayne. You take what's left. I build something new. We both move forward." He left the way he arrived, unhurried, certain, the Mercedes disappearing back through the gate with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once considered losing. Dwayne sat in the empty room for a long moment, the unsigned document on the table in front of him, his brother's logic laid out in clean legal paragraphs that smelled faintly of fresh ink. Then he heard the soft sound of a footstep in the hallway and looked up to find Dalia standing in the doorway, still in the borrowed clothes from the night before, and holding the wool socks in one hand. She had heard enough. He could see it in the way she was standing, that particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years listening through walls. "I'll go," she said quietly. "If it fixes it, I'll go." Dwayne picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years. When the line connected, he didn't look at the document. He didn't look at Fernando's photograph of the girl who had saved his life with a 4-inch blade. And he looked directly at Dalia and said, "Nobody's going anywhere. Get dressed. We have a meeting with the best immigration attorney in the state of Pennsylvania, and I need you to tell her everything you told me." Dalia didn't move immediately. In her experience, promises made in large rooms by powerful people were architecture, beautiful from the outside, built to serve the person who owned them. But the way Dwayne Santino said everything, without flinching, without calculating, the way a man speaks when he has already decided on a direction and is simply waiting for the world to catch up, made something shift behind her eyes. She went to get her shoes, and Dwayne, waiting for the attorney to pick up, turned the unsigned document face down on the table next to his brother's photograph and began to think about what it meant to fight a war with paperwork instead of force, and how, in his experience, while that was always the kind of war that left the deepest marks. She left before the attorney arrived. Dalia had listened to Dwayne's end of the phone call from the hallway, the clipped, assured tone of a man calling in a debt, and somewhere between pulling on her shoes and reaching for the borrowed wool socks, the arithmetic of the situation had rearranged itself in her head with a clarity that felt almost physical. Fernando's document, the Delaware holding company, 47 employees, the cafe in the ironbound district that smelled like his mother's cardamom, all of it sitting on one side of a scale, and on the other side, her. 13 years old, no papers, no country that was currently claiming her. She knew how that math worked. She had always known. The east wing had a window that opened onto a maintenance path running along the south fence. Dalia had identified it the previous night, the way she identified all exits, automatically, without drama, so the way other children memorized multiplication tables. The drop was 8 feet to a mulched garden bed. She'd cleared worse from a fire escape in Trenton. By the time Dwayne knocked on the guest room door at 11:40, she was already crossing the tree line at the edge of the Colts Neck property, moving north on instinct toward the sound of distant highway traffic. He found the room empty and the window open. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, and taking in the neatly folded blanket on the bed. She had made it before she left, which told him everything about the kind of child she was and the kind of life that had made her, and the wool socks placed precisely on the pillow like an apology. "Garrett." His voice carried down the hall without rising. "Already pulling the gate footage?" Garrett called back. The footage showed nothing. She had gone through the garden, not the gate. Dwayne looked at the maintenance path below the open window and felt something in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She hadn't run because she was ungrateful. She had run because she was trying to protect him, and the understanding of that made the situation considerably more urgent. He made 3 calls in 4 minutes. The first was to a man named Dex Holloway, who ran a private logistics operation out of Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, and who had eyes on most of the transit corridors between Monmouth County and Manhattan. a network built for the movement of goods that was equally fluent in the movement of information. The second was to a woman named Petra Sabo, who managed community outreach at a legal aid organization in Newark, and who knew the informal geography of the city's undocumented population better than any federal database. The third was to his driver, instructing him to bring the car around immediately. He did not call Harlan Fitch's office. That was the one call Fernando would be waiting for. Dalia made it to a bus stop on Route 34 by 1 in the afternoon. She sat at the far end of the bench with her knees together and her eyes tracking every passing vehicle with the practiced disinterest of someone who has learned that looking at things directly is sometimes its own form of visibility. The temperature had dropped since morning, and the borrowed clothes were not built for it. The shirt too light, the trousers doing nothing against the wind that rolled off the fields in flat, indifferent waves. She had $11, the remnants of a week of work she'd done for a produce supplier in Freehold before the Colt's Neck forest and the hole in the ground and the man whose fate she had accidentally bound to her own. She had no phone. She had no knife, which felt like missing a tooth. Not painful exactly, but registered constantly. A gap in the inventory of herself. The bus that arrived was heading north toward Newark. She took it, standing in the aisle because she didn't want to spend the fare on a seat when she might need every dollar before dark. She watched Pennsylvania move past the windows in its winterized form. The stripped trees, the gray commercial strips along the Parkway corridor, the water tower outside Woodbridge that had her aunt's neighborhood name written on it in faded blue letters. Her aunt had pointed to it once from a bus window, years ago, laughing because she said it meant the town was proud of something as ordinary as water pressure. Dalia pressed her forehead against the cold glass and did not cry. Dex Holloway called Dwayne at 2:17. "Newark Penn Station," he said. "Camera at the north entrance 90 minutes ago." She bought something from the vending bank on the lower level and went toward the NJ Transit Board. A pause. She looked at the train to New York for a long time before she walked away. Dwayne was already on the Garden State Parkway. She didn't take it. No, she's still in Newark, somewhere she feels like she knows the terrain. He thought about what she'd told him. The aunt, Trenton. The ironbound district and its Portuguese and Brazilian storefronts, and its specific gravity for people who arrived in Newark with nothing and needed the comfort of a street that smelled like somewhere else. "I know where she is," he said. The car changed lanes, and the Newark skyline rose ahead of them in the pale afternoon, complicated and indifferent, and full of the kind of people who had learned to be invisible in it. Dwayne leaned forward and told his driver to take the ironbound exit, so the cafe on Meridian, his mother's cafe, the copper counter and the cardamom, came into view 2 minutes later. And in the narrow alley beside it, sitting on the same kind of milk crate as the surveillance photograph, hugging her own elbows against the cold, was Dalia. She looked up when the car stopped. The expression on her face moved through several things quickly before settling on something that was not quite relief and not quite surrender, but existed somewhere between the two. Dwayne got out of the car, shrugged off his overcoat and held it out. She didn't take it immediately. Old habits. "How did you know?" she asked. "Because it's the one place in this city I always come back to," he said. "And you needed somewhere that felt like it belonged to someone who wasn't going to call the authorities." She looked at the coat, looked at him. "I was trying to make it easier for you," she said. "I know." He kept the coat extended. "You made it harder. All right, let's go." She stood, took the coat, and wrapped it around herself. It fell to her calves and swallowed her completely, which under different circumstances might have seemed almost comic. But when Dwayne turned back toward the car, he noticed Garrett was already on his phone in the passenger seat, expression tight, speaking in the low, quick register of someone receiving news that needed to be delivered carefully. Garrett lowered the phone and turned. Fitch didn't wait for the 24 hours, he said. There's a task force vehicle parked outside the Colt's Neck gate. They're asking to speak with you about a minor in your custody." The ironbound district hummed around them. Delivery trucks, kitchen exhaust, the ordinary machinery of a neighborhood that kept moving regardless of what powerful men decided about it. Dwayne looked at Dalia. She had heard every word, and she was very still, waiting to see which version of him would respond. "Then we give them something better to look at," he said, and opened the car door. They didn't go back to Colt's Neck. Dwayne made the decision before the car door finished closing, relaying it to his driver in 2 sentences, while Dalia settled into the back seat, with his overcoat still wrapped around her like a borrowed country. The task force at the gate changed the geometry of everything. The estate was visible now, catalogued, watched, a fixed point on Harlan Fitch's map. And fixed points were for people who believed they were untouchable. Dwayne had believed that once. The Pine Barrens had corrected him. "Where are we going?" Dalia asked. "Somewhere that doesn't exist on paper," he said. "Which means we get there in a way that doesn't exist on cameras." She absorbed this without further question. He had noticed that about her, the way she processed information quickly and silently, storing it, making adjustments, on never spending energy on reaction when adaptation was available. It was a quality he associated with people who had survived long stretches of uncertainty. It was not a quality that belonged in a 13-year-old, and its presence in her was both impressive and quietly devastating. The driver left the car in a private garage off Raymond Boulevard in downtown Newark and handed Dwayne a transit card without being asked, so Garrett peeled away in a separate vehicle, a deliberate division designed to draw any surveillance in 2 unhelpful directions. Dwayne walked with Dalia through the late afternoon foot traffic toward the Broad Street station entrance, 2 people at different scales moving at the same pace, which was either unremarkable or the most remarkable thing on the block, depending on who was watching. The station swallowed them in its familiar underground grammar, the smell of iron and recycled heat, the distant percussion of an approaching train, the particular acoustic flatness of tiled walls carrying sound in every direction at once. Dalia stayed close without being told to. Down here, she moved differently than she had on the surface, with more confidence, less exposure, the ease of someone returning to a familiar element. She knew this world. She had lived adjacent to it for 3 years. They didn't take the train. Dwayne led her past the platform, not through a maintenance door that responded to a key card he carried in his wallet behind everything else, and into the service corridor beyond. The passage was lit by industrial strips mounted too far apart, leaving stretches of shadow between pools of yellow light. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was concrete, dusty, marked by the passage of utility workers and no one else. Dalia looked at the corridor and then at him. "You have a key to the infrastructure of Pennsylvania Transit," she said. "I helped fund the renovation of this station 12 years ago," he said. "I kept certain access as a courtesy arrangement. That seems useful right now. That's why I kept it." They walked for 6 minutes through the service passage, the sound of trains registering as vibration through the walls rather than noise, the city moving above them unaware. The corridor connected beneath Raymond Boulevard to an adjacent building's basement, a connection that appeared on no public schematic, but that Dwayne knew the way he knew all useful things, through investment and patience and the understanding that infrastructure was its own form of power. The basement opened into a freight elevator. The elevator opened into a hallway on the 14th floor of a building whose lobby presented itself to the world as a mid-range accounting firm. Dwayne knocked on the door at the end of the hall. 3 beats, a pause, 2, and stepped back. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the bearing of someone who had once been exceptionally dangerous and had since redirected that energy into exceptional organization. Her name was Nora Vega. She had run logistics for 3 administrations worth of sensitive federal operations before retiring to what she described, with a straight face as private consulting. She looked at Dwayne, looked at Dalia, looked at the oversized overcoat. "I told you about the brother," Nora said without greeting. "You told me," he agreed. "And?" "And I need 48 hours and somewhere safe that Harlan Fitch's field office doesn't know exists." Nora stepped back and held the door open, but the apartment beyond was nothing like what the building's exterior suggested. Deep wool rugs, warm light, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and something slow-cooked, bookshelves built into every available wall. It looked like the home of someone who had earned their comforts one difficult year at a time. Dalia stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the room, taking it in. "The bathroom is the second door on the left," Nora said. "Go, there are clothes in the third drawer of the bedroom dresser. I have a niece around your size." She moved toward the kitchen without elaborating. "Eat first. The rest is easier when you're not running on empty." Dalia turned to look at Dwayne. Something in her expression asked a question she hadn't formed into words yet, about trust, about the logic of one stranger delivering her to another, about whether this was a chain or a net. "Nora spent 11 years getting people out of places that wanted to keep them," he said quietly. "She is currently the safest person in the state of New York and Pennsylvania combined." Nora called from the kitchen without turning around. "Flattery is accurate but unnecessary. Sit down, both of you." They sat. The building held them, solid and unmarked, and unknown to anyone looking at the street below. Dalia wrapped both hands around the mug Nora set in front of her and let the warmth move through her palms, and for approximately 4 minutes, nothing required anything from either of them. Then Dwayne's phone lit up with a message from Petra Szabo at the Newark Legal Aid Office, and the 4 minutes ended. The message was 3 words. "Fernando called me." Petra Szabo's message sat on Dwayne's screen like a lit fuse. He read it twice, set the phone face down on Nora's table, and looked at the coffee in his mug for a moment, the way a man looks at something ordinary when his mind is moving too fast for his body to follow. Then he picked the phone back up and called her. She answered on the first ring, which told him she had been waiting. "He reached out this morning," Petra said. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone choosing each word with both hands. "Presented himself as a concerned party, and said a young, undocumented girl had been taken by a man with a criminal history, and that any organization with community ties had an obligation to flag her location if they encountered her." A pause. He used the word obligation 3 times. "He's building a record," Dwayne said, establishing that he tried legitimate channels. "That was my read, too." Another pause, shorter. "Dwayne, he knew about the Freehold connection, the produce supplier, and he knew she had worked there." The room recalibrated around that sentence. Across the table, Dalia had gone still in the particular way she went still when information was arriving that concerned her directly, not rigid, not afraid, just present in a concentrated way. Every sense pointed forward. She was wearing the clothes Nora had produced from the dresser, a gray pullover and dark trousers that fit better than the borrowed things from Colt's neck, and she looked, like in the warm light of the safe house kitchen, like someone who had recently remembered that she was allowed to occupy space. Dwayne lowered the phone. "The produce supplier in Freehold. How long did you work there?" 4 months, she said. "Maybe 5. Did you sign anything? Fill out any forms?" She almost smiled, the expression of someone encountering a question whose naivety is almost charming. "They didn't ask for forms." He nodded and raised the phone again. "I need the business registration on the Freehold operation," he told Petra. "And anything else she's connected to. Any address she used, any employer, any location Fernando's file might have pulled. Send it to my attorney." He ended the call and looked at Nora, who was standing at the kitchen counter, with her arms crossed, and the reading glasses down from her forehead now, which he had learned years ago meant she was working. "The produce supplier," he said. "Already looked it up," Nora replied, setting her tablet on the table between them. "Registered in Delaware. Parent company is a holding entity called Brightfield Agricultural Services, LLC, incorporated 14 months ago." She turned the screen so he could see it. "The registered agent is a law firm in Trenton. I've seen that firm's name before, on documents that moved through a Port Authority dispute in Camden 2 years ago." Dwayne looked at the screen. Then he looked at Dalia. "Who paid you?" he asked, not unkindly, carefully. She thought about it. "A man named Teo. He came on Fridays with an envelope. Cash. Always the same amount, always a little short of what was agreed." She paused. "There were 11 of us in that warehouse. Different languages. Nobody asked questions because the asking was the thing that got you removed." Nora was already typing. The room filled with the soft percussion of her working. Keys, a quiet exhale, the faint scrape of the tablet stylus. Outside, 14 floors below, Manhattan-bound traffic moved along Raymond Boulevard with the indifferent momentum of a city that had no awareness of what was being assembled in its airspace. The picture that emerged over the next 40 minutes was not complicated, which was the most damning thing about it. Fernando's financial architecture was a series of nested shells, companies that existed on paper, are registered in Delaware and Nevada, where disclosure requirements were thin, each one conducting just enough legitimate-looking business to justify its bank activity. The freehold warehouse was one node in a network of 7 similar operations scattered across Pennsylvania and lower New York State. Workers paid in cash, off any recordable ledger. Revenue declared as agricultural processing. The gap between what came in and what was reported was filled on paper, so by inflated equipment costs and phantom contracts, and the money that filled that gap was moving through the Camden logistics terminal that Fernando had demanded Dwayne sign over. He had tried to bury his brother and inherit the machine his brother had spent 17 years building. Then he had planned to run his own operation through it. Dalia had worked inside Fernando's laundry for 5 months without either of them knowing the other existed. Nora set the tablet down. He used those workers as structural insulation. If anyone investigated, the workers take the exposure. They're undocumented. They scatter. The shells survive. The room held that for a moment. Dwayne looked at Dalia, who was looking at the tablet with an expression that was working through several things at once. The retroactive understanding of what she had been part of. The particular anger of someone who discovers they were used as a component in something designed to harm people exactly like them. "He was going to deport me," she said slowly, "to protect a business I was already working in. Yes. And if I had just left, if I had gone this morning like I planned, you would have been processed and removed before any of this surfaced," Dwayne said. "The witness disappears. The paper trail stays buried. See, Fernando keeps the machine." She was quiet for a long time. Then she straightened in the chair. Not a dramatic gesture, just a subtle realignment. The physical equivalent of a decision being reached. "What do you need from me?" Nora and Dwayne exchanged a brief look, the compressed communication of people who have worked together long enough to have a shorthand. "Names," Nora said. "Locations, dates, anything you remember about the warehouse, the man named Teo, the other workers. Not for a courtroom yet, just for our attorney to build the framework." She slid a yellow legal pad across the table. "Everything you remember. Start where you want." Dalia picked up the pen. It was clear she was not accustomed to being asked to start where she wanted. She held it for a moment, considering, and then began to write in small, to precise letters that suggested a person who had once been carefully educated and had maintained that precision through conditions that should have eroded it. Dwayne's phone buzzed. His attorney, a measured woman named Sylvia Richmond, who operated out of a quiet office on Broad Street in Newark, and who had, in Dwayne's experience, never once raised her voice and never once lost, had received Petra's documentation. Her message was characteristically brief. "This is not a defense. This is a prosecution. Call me in the morning. We have work to do." He set the phone down and watched Dalia fill the first page of the legal pad. The scratch of the pen, the only sound in the room, besides the deep, indifferent hum of the building, holding them safe inside the city that Fernando believed he had already won. The paper trail that Fernando had built to protect himself was about to become the road that led directly to him. What Dwayne did not know yet, what Nora's expression, shifting almost imperceptibly toward the window, suggested she was already calculating, was that by morning, Fernando would know the documentation was moving. And a man who had already tried burial once would not wait patiently for the legal process to reach him. Fernando made his move at 7 in the morning. The broadcast aired on a Newark-based news affiliate first, then rippled outward through the regional networks, the way fabrications always do when they're well-dressed, quickly, and with the confidence of something that doesn't expect to be examined too closely. Nora had the television on low in the safe house living room when the segment began, and she turned up the volume without comment, which was its own form of editorial judgment. Fernando Santino was not what most people expected when they heard the family name. He was lean, where Dwayne was solid, soft-spoken, where Dwayne filled a room, with the kind of face that photographed as trustworthy, open, and slightly tired, the face of a man burdened by something he hadn't chosen. He sat across from the interviewer in a chair that suggested a private setting, casual enough to imply candor, and he spoke about his brother, the way a person speaks about a wound they've decided to stop hiding. Dalia stood in the kitchen doorway in her borrowed gray pullover and watched the screen. "My brother has struggled for years," Fernando said, his voice carrying precisely the right weight of reluctant sorrow. "I've tried to reach him through proper channels. What I cannot stay silent about, what no decent person could stay silent about, is that there is a young girl, a vulnerable child, who has been in his custody for several days now, with no legal authorization, no family notification, and no contact with child welfare services." He paused, letting the interviewer's expression do the work he didn't need to say aloud. "I am asking, through every appropriate authority in the state of Pennsylvania, for someone to find her and make sure she is safe." The interviewer asked if he had any idea where his brother might be. "That's for law enforcement to determine," Fernando said. "I just want the girl found." The segment ended. Nora muted the television. The safe house held its breath for a moment, the refrigerator cycling, a bus moving 14 floors below, the faint ticking of the hallway radiator making its morning sounds. Dalia turned to look at Dwayne, who was sitting at the table with his coffee and his phone, and the expression of a man watching chess pieces move on a board that he had already solved 2 games ahead. "You're not going to respond," she said. "Not a question." "Not yet. He's going to be believed. For now," Dwayne said. "Yes." She looked back at the muted screen, where the segment had given way to a weather map of the tri-state area, all of it indifferent to the fact that Fernando Santino had just spent 4 minutes turning her into a rescue narrative and turning his brother into a headline. "He made me sympathetic," she said slowly. "The worried public will look for me. ICE looks for me. Everyone is looking for a missing girl, and anyone who finds me hands me directly to Harlan Fitch. That's the design. So the story protects him while it hunts me." Dwayne set his coffee down. "It also locks him into a public position. He's on record now. Concerned brother, legitimate channels, child welfare. He cannot be seen doing anything that contradicts that image from this moment forward." He picked up his phone and turned it so she could see the screen. Sylvia Richmond's message from 20 minutes ago read, "His public statement is a gift. Document everything. Say nothing. Call me at 9. Dalia studied the message, and something behind her eyes shifted from apprehension toward the particular focus of someone who has just understood the shape of a larger game. Nora refilled her own coffee and sat at the head of the table with the legal pad from the previous night. Dalia's precise, small handwriting covering 4 full pages. "The names you gave us," she said. "I ran 2 of them this morning. Naiteo, full name Theodore Bannock, has a registered address in Carteret that connects to 2 of Fernando's shell entities in Pennsylvania. The second name, the woman who managed the overnight shift at the Freehold warehouse, has already spoken to a labor rights organization in Newark, voluntarily, this morning." The table registered that. "She spoke to someone," Dwayne said carefully. "She saw the broadcast." Nora looked at him over her glasses. Apparently, she recognized the Santino name and understood, perhaps better than Fernando anticipated, exactly what it meant that his name was now attached to a public story about vulnerable workers and missing children. Outside, the November morning pressed gray and cold against the windows of a city that was now, in its own unwitting way, paying attention to the name Fernando Santino had just made prominent. Dwayne's phone rang. Garrett, and calling from the Colts Neck estate, where the task force vehicle had finally departed sometime around dawn. "The affiliate that ran the segment," Garrett said, "received the Fernando Santino interview tip from a publicist. The publicist's firm has a billing address in Hoboken. I had someone pull their client roster." Dwayne waited. "Deputy Director Harlan Fitch has been a client for 11 months. The final piece of architecture became visible. Fernando and Fitch, on a coordinated, not just operationally, but narratively, building a public story that would make everything that followed look like legitimate government action in response to genuine community concern. It was, by any honest measure, a sophisticated construction. It was also now documented. Dwayne looked at Dalia, who was still standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him with the steady, evaluating attention she'd turned on him the night in the Pine Barrens when he'd held out his hand, and waited. "Sylvia calls at 9, he said. "After that, I need you to be willing to do something that will feel like the most frightening thing you've done since the forest." She waited. "I need you to be willing to be found," he said. "On our terms, in a room we choose, by people who will ask you questions on the record." The radiator ticked. The city moved below them. "A courtroom?" she asked. "A hearing," he said. "There's a difference, and I need you to understand it completely before we walk through that door." She was quiet for a long moment, not the paralyzed quiet of fear, but the working quiet of a girl doing the arithmetic of risk and deciding again, as she had decided in the mud of a Pennsylvania forest, not to run. She pushed off the doorframe, crossed to the table, and sat down across from him. "Explain the difference," she said. And somewhere in an office with Fernando Santino's name on the billing roster, a publicist sent a follow-up press release to 3 more affiliates, unaware that the silence from Dwayne Santino's camp was not retreat, but the particular patience of a man who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to let the other side finish building before he knocked it down. The hearing room was smaller than Dalia had imagined. She had constructed it in her mind over the preceding 48 hours as something vast and punishing. High ceilings, cold marble, the full institutional weight of a country deciding what to do with a person it had never officially acknowledged. What she found instead was a wood-paneled chamber on the 4th floor of a federal building on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Newark, with 4 windows that looked out onto the kind of November sky that couldn't decide between gray and white, and a central table that seated perhaps 12. The American flag stood in the corner with the particular stillness of objects that have witnessed everything and judged nothing. Judge Adrienne Pace was already seated when they entered, when she was a compact woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the manner of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by anything that walked through her door. She looked at the room's occupants: Sylvia Richmond at the respondents' table, Fernando's attorney across from her, a representative from the ICE field office 2 chairs down, and Dalia, in a navy blue dress Nora had produced that morning with no explanation of its origin, and she looked at the assembled documentation already waiting in folders before her. She had not looked at Fernando yet, though he sat directly in her sightline. That, Dalia thought, was its own kind of message. Dwayne sat behind the bar in the gallery, 1 row back, with Garrett beside him. He had not spoken to Dalia since they entered the building beyond 4 words in the elevator. You know the truth. It was enough. It was, in its way, everything. Sylvia Richmond opened without preamble. She was a woman who trusted precision over theatrics, and her opening statement lasted 6 minutes and contained, Dalia counted, 0 unnecessary words. She established the timeline of the Pine Barrens, the date, the location in Burlington County, the 4 masked men, to the attempted burial of Dwayne Santino. She established Dalia's presence as a witness. She established the folding knife and what it accomplished. She then moved, with the unhurried confidence of someone laying track for a train she knew was coming, to the documentation. The shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, the freehold warehouse, the Carteret address connecting Theodore Bannock to Brightfield Agricultural Services, LLC, the billing relationship between Deputy Director Harlan Fitch and the Hoboken publicist, the coordinated broadcast. Fernando's attorney objected twice. Judge Pace overruled both times with a patience that suggested she had read the briefing documents thoroughly and found them persuasive before anyone said a word. Then it was Dalia's turn. She had been told to speak only to the judge, to use the simplest words available, to stop if she didn't understand a question, and say so plainly, because clarity was not weakness, it was precision. Sylvia had told her this the previous evening at Nora's table, while the radiator ticked, and Dwayne sat quietly with his coffee, and didn't tell her what to say, only that saying it was the only thing left that mattered. Judge Pace looked at her directly. "Tell me about the night of the forest in your own words," Dalia told her. Well, she started with the cold, the specific cold of November, ground through her stomach as she pressed herself flat into the Pine Barrens mud. She described the 4 men, their movements, their masks. She described Dwayne's hands pressing into the earth, the way his eyes found her in the brush without desperation, just awareness. She described the knife, the 6 feet of air it crossed, the sound it made landing in his palm like a dropped coin. She spoke for 11 minutes. Her voice did not waver. The room did not move. When she finished, Judge Pace made a note on the legal pad before her and did not look up immediately. Fernando's attorney started to speak. The judge raised one hand without lifting her eyes from the page, and the attorney stopped. "Mr. Santino," she said finally, addressing Fernando for the first time. "Your counsel has presented this hearing as a child welfare matter. The documentation before me suggests it is substantially a financial crimes matter, with a child welfare concern attached as a mechanism." She removed her glasses. "I want to be precise about that distinction, because it will determine the next 48 hours considerably." Fernando's expression did not break, but his hands, folded on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sylvia Richmond placed a final document before the judge, the signed testimony of the woman from the freehold overnight shift, notarized in Newark the previous day. Judge Pace read it. The room waited. "I'm referring the financial documentation to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Pennsylvania," she said. "Effective immediately." She set her glasses back on. "As for the child, she stays." The 2 words arrived simply, without ceremony, and the way the most significant things tend to arrive. Dalia looked at her hands, flat on the table before her, the same hands that had thrown a knife through cold air in a Pennsylvania forest and changed everything. She did not cry, because she had spent 3 years rationing that too, and some habits take longer than a hearing to release. But across the room, she heard Dwayne exhale, a long, quiet breath that had been held, she suspected, since the Pine Barrens. And that sound was enough. On outside the 4 windows, the Newark sky had finally resolved itself into something clear. It was still cold. But the light at last was coming through. Fernando was arrested on a Tuesday. It happened without drama, which was perhaps the most fitting thing about it. No sirens, no cameras, no performance. 2 federal agents from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Pennsylvania met him in the lobby of his attorney's building on Market Street in Newark at 9:40 in the morning. And by 9:43 he was in handcuffs, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who had built an elaborate structure and was only now watching it fall, understanding how much of it had been held together by the assumption that he would never be the one standing in the rubble. Dwayne was not there to see it. He had made that choice deliberately. Garrett told him by phone 1 sentence, and Dwayne received it, standing in the kitchen of the Colts Neck estate with his coffee, for looking out at the frost-stripped lawn that had looked the same way the morning Dr. Osei came to confirm the toxin. He said nothing for a moment. Then he set the mug down, rinsed it in the sink, and went upstairs to find Dalia. She was in the guest room, and sitting cross-legged on the bed with a book Nora had pressed into her hands at the safe house. A worn paperback whose title she had not mentioned, and whose pages she turned with the focused attention of someone who had not had access to something as uncomplicated as a story in a very long time. She looked up when he knocked on the open door. "It's done," he said. She closed the book over her thumb, holding her place. An old habit, he had noticed. She marked things carefully, and never assuming she would be able to return to them. Fitch, too. Suspended pending investigation. His office is cooperating, which means he's already negotiating. Dwayne leaned against the doorframe. The freehold workers, the ones who can be located, are being connected with Petra's organization. The labor rights case runs separately from the criminal one. She absorbed this in the quiet, organized way she absorbed everything. Then she looked at the book in her hands, and something in her expression moved through several chambers before settling somewhere that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. "And me?" she asked. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a document, not the clean, threatening thing Fernando had placed on his coffee table weeks ago, but something altogether different. An official form, bearing the seal of the immigration court, a Judge Pace's signature across the bottom, in the deliberate hand of a woman who trusted the weight of her name. He set it on the bed beside her. Dalia looked at it for a long time without picking it up. When she finally did, she held it the way she had held the coffee mug at Nora's table, with both hands, as though the warmth of it might be temporary. Her name was on it. Her actual name, spelled correctly, unattached to a legal status in a country that had spent 3 years pretending she didn't exist. She set it down very carefully on the nightstand, smoothed it once with her palm, and did not say anything for long enough that the radiator in the hallway completed a full cycle. "There's something I want to show you," Dwayne said. He took her down the east corridor, past the room Garrett used as an office, to a door at the end of the hall that had been closed since she arrived. He opened it. The room inside was not large, but it had a window that faced the Colts Neck grounds and the bare winter trees beyond the fence, and the afternoon light came through it at an angle that made the space feel considered rather than empty. Against the wall, where presumably nothing had been as recently as 48 hours ago, stood a bed. Not a cot. Not a fold-out. Not the kind of provisional furniture that communicates a temporary arrangement. A real bed, a proper frame in warm oak, A mattress that looked dense and certain of itself. A duvet in deep blue that reminded her, inexplicably, of the color of the sky in a country she had left when she was 10 and still sometimes dreamed about without guilt. Beside it was a small desk and a lamp and a shelf that was empty in the deliberate way of something waiting to be filled. Dalia stood in the doorway and looked at it. Dwayne stood behind her and said nothing, because he had learned early in their acquaintance that she processed best in the absence of pressure. "This is mine," she said finally. Not a question. "If you want it to be." She walked to the bed slowly, ran one hand along the edge of the frame, the way you touch something you're not yet sure you're permitted to have, and sat on the edge. The mattress received her weight with the uncomplicated solidity of something built to last. Dwayne waited in the doorway. "I have a bag," she said. "No, it's at the estate, from the first night." The words carried the full weight of what that bag represented. 3 years of compressed living, everything owned, reduced to what could be carried and abandoned quickly. Possessions selected for their utility and disappearing. "I know," he said. "I've repacked it every morning since I got here. Habit. I know that too." She looked at the empty shelf. Then she looked at the window and the pale December light making its way through the bare trees of Monmouth County, honest and uncomplicated, and asking nothing from her. "I'd like to unpack it," she said quietly. "If that's—" "I'd like to." Dwayne nodded once. "I'll have Garrett bring it up." He moved to leave. She stopped him with a question that she asked toward the window, not toward him, in the careful tone of someone approaching something they've been carrying for a long time. "Oh, the cafe," she said. "Your mother's. What happens to it now?" He was quiet for a moment. The question had more weight than its surface suggested. She understood that, which was why she'd asked it facing the window. The cafe was the place Fernando had poisoned. The copper counter and the cardamom and the recipe cards in the drawer. The place Dwayne returned to every Thursday, until he didn't. "I haven't decided," he said. She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her expression that was new. Not the calculating steadiness of a girl reading exits, not the compressed restraint of someone managing their own weight in a stranger's house. Something more forward-facing than that. "I think you should keep it," she said. "I think some places are too honest to abandon." He looked at her for a long moment. This 13-year-old girl with wild curls and freckles and 4 pages of precise handwriting that had helped dismantle his brother's empire, sitting on the edge of her first real bed in a room that was, finally, irreversibly hers. "Get some rest," he said. Real rest. He pulled the door almost closed behind him. Through the narrow gap, he heard the small, specific sound of a zipper. Her bag, an opening. And then the quiet, unhurried rustle of someone finally, deliberately, putting things down. Somewhere in Newark, in a room that smelled of copper and cardamom, and his mother's particular idea of welcome, a light above the cafe's door was still on. He had left it burning every night for 11 years, out of habit and love, and the stubborn belief that certain things deserved to remain lit. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the right decision,